door to Lucy Yates' eating house swung open on a bitter October wind, and the man who walked through it looked like something the frontier had chewed up and spat back out. Lucy did not look up from the counter she was wiping. She had learned long ago that in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, men who came through doors in the manner of this one slow, deliberate, as though they owned whatever space they entered, were the kind of men a woman alone did best to ignore until absolutely necessary. She kept her rag moving in long, sure strokes across the pine surface, listening to the creak of floorboards as he crossed the room, listening to the scrape of a chair being pulled out, listening to the unmistakable sound of a stranger sitting himself down at her last occupied table without so much as a word of greeting or permission. She looked up then. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his early 30s by the deep-cut lines around his eyes, though the eyes themselves were young in a way that made her feel unsteady. They were gray, the color of a sky that can't decide whether to storm. His hat was brown and beaten, his duster coat the color of dried earth, and his hands, both of them flat on her table, fingers spread wide, were scarred in the peculiar way of a man who had worked with rope and iron, and neither had ever been particularly kind to him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You are sitting at a private table," Lucy said. "I am," he agreed pleasantly. "I did not invite you to sit there." "No," he said, "you did not." The two other men eating their supper at the far table had gone very still in the way of men who sense entertainment forming. Lucy straightened, set down her cloth, and walked toward the stranger with the deliberate calm she had spent 3 years perfecting. 3 years of running this eating house alone, since her husband Thomas had gone into the ground with a fever and left her with a mortgage, a reputation for good cornbread, and absolutely nothing else. She stopped at the edge of the table and folded her hands. "This is my establishment," she said. "Every seat in it is mine to assign or withhold as I see fit. Now I will ask you once politely to either state your business or remove yourself." The man tilted his head, and something moved in those storm-gray eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge. It was more complicated than either, and it made the back of Lucy's neck prickle with a warning she could not entirely name. "My business," he said, "is hunger." He said it plainly, the way a man might report a weather condition. And then, before she could respond, before she could draw breath and deliver the dismissal she had perfectly prepared, he said the words that would change the course of everything she thought she understood about herself, about this winter, about what survival could look like when it came wearing a stranger's face. "Feed me once," he said, "and I will stay the winter." The room went absolutely silent. Lucy Yates stood at the edge of that table and felt the world she had so carefully rebuilt tilt on its axis like a wagon wheel striking an unexpected stone. It had not always been this fragile, this life she was living. 3 years ago, before Thomas died, before the mortgage came due, and the townspeople started measuring her with that particular look that said widow and alone and won't last and other things too cruel to speak aloud, Lucy Yates had been the kind of woman who laughed easily and planned freely and believed without serious question that the future was a country she had every right to travel into. She had come to Caldwell as a bride. That was 1879. When the cattle drives were still coming up through the Kisham Trail with their noise and their money and their temporary wildness, when Caldwell was calling itself the queen of the border towns, and was not entirely wrong to do so. Thomas Yates had been a decent man, a quiet man, a carpenter who built good furniture and charged fair prices, and had the misfortune of a weak constitution that he never advertised and may not have fully understood himself. He had courted Lucy with a kind of earnest steadiness that she had mistaken, at 22, for the foundation of a lasting life. He lasted 2 years. The fever took him in the spring of 1881, fast and mean and without ceremony, and Lucy had stood at his grave on a cold April morning with $43 to her name, and the dawning understanding that everything she had counted on was now required to be rebuilt entirely from scratch. The eating house had been Thomas's idea, actually. A thing he had spoken about in the way people speak about dreams they find comfortable to carry, but do not quite intend to act upon. Lucy had acted upon it with the systematic ferocity of a woman who has no other options. She had taken the $43, added it to what she could borrow from the cattleman's bank at a rate that made her stomach clench, converted the front 2 rooms of her house into a dining space, and begun cooking. She was a remarkable cook. This was not vanity. It was simply a fact she had understood the way she understood other practical realities, like the fact that water ran downhill, and that winter in southern Kansas could kill a person who was not prepared for it. She had a natural, almost intuitive relationship with food, with how flavors built and balanced, with timing, with the specific alchemy that turned raw materials into something that made people close their eyes when they chewed. Word had spread the way word spread in frontier towns, which was fast and thorough, and beyond the control of the person it concerned. Within 6 months, Lucy's eating house was feeding not only the transient cowboys who came through with the drives, but also the merchants and the lawyers and the railroad men who were increasingly important as the cattle trade slowly, painfully shifted its geography northward, and left towns like Caldwell scrambling to reinvent themselves. By the autumn of 1882, she was not prospering exactly. The mortgage was a constant low-grade terror, and feeding herself came second to feeding the paying customers, but she was surviving. She had built something. It was small and it was fragile, and it depended entirely on her continued health and effort, but it existed, and she had built it with her own hands, and she was not going to let a gray-eyed drifter with a talent for audacity dismantle it by walking through her door uninvited and making pronouncements. "I beg your pardon," she said, very quietly. "I think you heard me," he said. "I heard a man make a declaration that makes no particular sense and was not requested by anyone in this room." She paused. "Who are you?" "Phineas Garrett." He said it the way people say names they have learned not to be ashamed of, which is to say carefully and without inflection that might suggest they expect it to mean anything. And it did not mean anything to Lucy, not yet. Not a name she recognized from any wanted poster she had seen pinned to the post office wall, not a name attached to any reputation that had preceded it into Caldwell. Just a name, just a man. Just the 2 most dangerous words she had ever heard sitting quietly between them on a pine table in her small eating house. "Feed me once and I will stay the winter," Phineas Garrett said again, not louder, not softer, just again, patient as stone. The 2 men at the far table were definitely listening now, not even pretending otherwise. "You will stay the winter," Lucy repeated. "And what exactly does that mean? That you intend to take up residence here uninvited as well?" "It means," he said, "that I have skills you need and I can see that plain from here." He let his gaze travel the room without drama, without any gesture of contempt, but with the methodical attention of someone who is cataloging facts. "Your south wall has a gap in the chinking that will cost you heat you cannot spare. Your wood supply in the yard is insufficient for a Kansas winter by at least 2 cords. The step on your porch is cracked through and will fail under snow, and whoever is supposed to be helping you run this place is not here." He brought his eyes back to her face. "I'm a man who can fix those things. I work hard and I work honest. Feed me once and I will stay until spring and earn my keep every day of it." Lucy Yates did not speak for a long moment. The wind pressed against the window glass and made a sound like someone breathing too close. "You are a stranger," she said finally. "I do not know you, I did not send for you, and I have no reason to trust a single word you have said." "True," Phineas Garrett said. "You walked into my establishment uninvited and sat at a table without permission, and issued what amounts to a condition of employment without being asked. Also true." "Give me one good reason," she said, and there was something cracking open in her voice that she did not intend and could not quite close, something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with exhaustion, with the cold that was already fingering through that gap in the south wall he had correctly identified. with the fact that she had lain awake 4 nights in a row doing sums that would not come out favorably no matter how she arranged them. Give me one good reason why I should not have you removed from this establishment right now. Phineas Garrett looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen things she had not seen, weathered roads she had not traveled, and he said, quietly and without artifice, "Because you need help and you know it, and I am asking honestly instead of taking what I could take, and that makes me the rarest kind of man you will encounter in a border town in winter." One of the men at the far table made a sound that might have been approval or might have been suppressed laughter. Lucy could not tell. She did not look to find out. She looked at Phineas Garrett for 4 heartbeats, 5, 6. Then she went to the kitchen and came back with a bowl of beef stew, a thick heel of cornbread, and a cup of coffee that was still hot enough to mean something. She set them in front of him and said, "I have not agreed to anything." "No," he said, "you have not. I am feeding you because it is late, and because waste is a sin, and because I made too much stew." She straightened and looked at him with a directness she hoped communicated the full complexity of her position. "In the morning you will come back at 7 o'clock and you will show me what you can do, and I will decide then whether you stay or go." Phineas Garrett picked up his spoon. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He took one bite. Something shifted in his expression, not exaggerated, not performative, but genuine and immediate, the involuntary response of a body encountering something better than it expected. He looked at the bowl, then at her. She had already turned back toward the kitchen. She spent the next 40 minutes telling herself that she had done nothing impulsive. She had made a practical decision based on observable need. The wall gap was real. The wood supply was genuinely insufficient. The porch step was dangerous. These were not invented problems. She was not a fool, and she was not susceptible to gray-eyed drifters who made theatrical pronouncements over uninvited suppers. She told herself these things with the particular energy of a woman who knows she is not entirely convincing herself. When she came back out to clear the table, he was gone. The bowl was empty, the cornbread was gone, the coffee cup was drained. Beside the cup, weighted down by nothing because there was no wind inside the room, was a coin, a 20-cent piece, set carefully on the table. It was not enough for a proper supper, and they both would have known that, but it was something. It was the particular something of a man who has very little and is nonetheless offering a portion of it, and Lucy stood with the empty bowl in her hands and stared at that coin for a longer time than was strictly reasonable. She picked it up and put it in her apron pocket. Outside, the October wind was picking up, and somewhere to the north the first real cold of the season was building itself up to cross the border into Kansas. The winter was coming whether she was ready for it or not. 7 o'clock the next morning came in gray and sharp, with a hard frost that whitened the ground, and made the packed dirt of the street outside her window look like something carved out of pale stone. Lucy had been up since 5, which was ordinary for her. The bread needed to go in early, the coffee needed to be on before the first customers arrived, and there were accounts to review that she had been avoiding for a week, because the numbers were not going to improve between midnight and dawn, no matter how determinedly she wished otherwise. She was at the kitchen table with the account spread before her when she heard it, the rhythmic, purposeful sound of an axe splitting wood, coming from the direction of the yard behind the house. She got up slowly, deliberately. She told herself she was not hurrying. She opened the back door and found Phineas Garrett in her wood yard at 6:47 in the morning, a full 13 minutes before he was supposed to be there, in no coat despite the cold, working through her depleted wood supply with the focused, economical precision of a man who was not performing labor for an audience, but simply doing it because it needed to be done. He had, she saw immediately, already been to the woodpile at the edge of the yard. Beside him, to the left, was a stack of freshly split logs that had not existed the previous night. He had sourced the wood from somewhere. She would ask about that in a moment, and he had been here long enough and working hard enough to have produced a stack that represented several hours of effort. He saw her in the doorway and stopped, straightened, rested the axe handle against his hip. Where did that wood come from? She asked. Hendrick's Mill, about a mile east. The miller sells green scraps by the cord cheap, if you don't mind that they need splitting. He paused. I paid for the first cord with money I had. It can come out of my wages once we settle what those are, or it can be my contribution to the arrangement. Either way. Lucy absorbed this. You went out before dawn and bought wood. I went out before dark last evening after I left here, he said. Loaded it on a borrowed wagon and brought it around, but it was too late to start on it, so I left it at the edge of the yard. Came back at 5 this morning to start splitting. He had been working in her yard since 5 in the morning. Lucy did not know what to do with this information, so she did what she frequently did with information she did not know what to do with. She set it aside and focused on something practical. Come inside when you need coffee, she said. Thank you, he said. He went back to the wood. She went back to the accounts. 30 minutes later, he knocked on the back door frame. She had left the door open a crack, and she said, "Come in." And he came in and stood at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and looked at the account spread across it with an expression that was careful and neutral. How long has the mortgage been behind? He asked. She looked up sharply. Those are private. They are, he agreed. But the numbers are facing toward me from here. I did not mean to pry. She considered telling him to look elsewhere. She considered a number of things. She said instead, against what felt like her better judgment but also somehow entirely like herself, 40 days. They have been patient because I have never missed a payment before. But if I cannot make the November payment plus the arrears by the end of the month, the bank has the right to begin foreclosure proceedings. She said it flat and factual, the way she said all the hard things, because making them dramatic did not make them smaller. It is not a catastrophic amount in absolute terms, but it is more than I have at present. Phineas Garrett sat down across from her. This time she had not told him to sit, but he sat as though it was a question he was posing rather than a declaration he was making, with a slight hesitation that acknowledged the presumption. She did not tell him to move. How many covers are you running at dinner? He asked. 8 on a good evening, sometimes 12 if a cattle outfit is passing through, but the drives are late in the season now, October. Most of the herds have already gone north or finished their runs. It will be quieter until spring. What do you charge? 15 cents for a full supper with bread and coffee, 25 for beef. He nodded slowly. What if you could seat 20? This room seats 12 at present. Not if you move the far table against the wall and bring in the 2 folding tables I saw in the back room. 20 seats, maybe 22. More seats do not produce more customers. No, he said. But you have a reputation for good cooking. The question is whether the people in this town know you exist in a systematic way or whether they are finding you by accident. He paused. I saw a hotel 2 blocks south. Do they have a dining room? They had one. The cook left in September and they have not replaced him. Something moved in Phineas Garrett's expression. It was the look of a man who has just seen a door standing open in a fence he thought was solid. What if, he said, you speak to the hotel about providing their evening meal service? You cook here, they send their guests to you, you split the house fee with the hotel. Their guests get good food, their reputation recovers, and you double your covers without needing to find new customers from scratch. Lucy stared at him. That is, she said carefully, actually not an unreasonable idea. I have been in a lot of towns, he said. It was not boastful, it was just a fact offered plainly. You see patterns after a while, you see what works. She looked at him across the accounts. Outside, the cold Kansas morning was brightening incrementally, and through the kitchen window she could see the stack of fresh split wood in the yard, real and solid and representing several hours of a stranger's labor. What is your dark past, Phineas Garrett? She said. He blinked. It was the first time she had seen him caught off balance, just slightly, and it was interesting. Beg your pardon. Men do not drift without reason. You are clearly not without intelligence, and you are clearly not without skill. Men like that do not end up wandering into strangers' eating houses making declarations about winter arrangements unless something has gone wrong somewhere. So I am asking you plainly because I intend to make an informed decision about whether you stay. What is your dark past? He held her gaze. A long, considered silence. I was a Pinkerton man, he said finally. Detective work, surveillance, working cases for the agency. I was good at it. I worked it for 6 years. He stopped, started again. I was working a fraud case 2 years ago. A man named Corrigan running a land scheme in Missouri, selling land parcels that either did not exist or had already been sold 3 times over. He had taken money from a lot of people who could not afford to lose it. He turned his hat in his hands, one slow rotation. I had enough to bring him in. Good evidence, clean case. But Corrigan had a partner inside the agency. Someone I trusted. The evidence got buried, Corrigan disappeared west, and I was let go for the official word was insubordination. He paused. I spent a year looking for him after that, found him in Colorado. Brought what I had to the local marshal. It held up in court that time. Corrigan is in prison in Denver as of this spring. Lucy waited. After that, he said, I did not go back to the agency. I had been moving for 2 years by then. Moving agrees with me better than it probably should. He looked at the table. There is nothing else you need to know about my past that would change whether I can fix your south wall or split your wood. No, Lucy agreed. But it changes whether I can trust your character, and I needed to know that. He looked up at her. And I think you told me a true thing, she said. I think people who tell true things about themselves when asked directly are worth more consideration than people who deflect. She stood up and folded the accounts closed. Your wages will be room and board for the winter. The room is small. There is a storage room at the back that I can clear. It has a stove connection and a cot. On days when you work more than 6 hours, you will receive 20 cents on top. If your idea about the hotel produces additional revenue, I will review the arrangement in December. Phineas Garrett looked at her with those steady gray eyes. Yes, ma'am, he said. That is more than fair. Do not call me ma'am, she said. I am 25 years old. My name is Lucy. You may use it. Something changed in his face then, just briefly, there and then carefully neutral again, and she was too honest with herself not to notice it even if she was not ready to think about what it meant. Yes, he said. Lucy. Her name in his voice was an entirely unremarkable thing, and she was irritated at herself for noticing the specific way it wasn't. The first week was transactional. That was the word she kept using in her own mind. A word she had learned from watching Thomas handle business, transactional, functional, practical. Phineas worked and she cooked and served and kept accounts, and they occupied the same space with the careful, negotiated distance of 2 people who are aware of each other's presence in a specific, physically adjacent way, and have agreed, without words, to keep that awareness at a manageable volume. He fixed the south wall chinking on the first day. Working with a mortar mixture he made himself from materials he found in the storage shed. He replaced the porch step on the second day, finding suitable board in the remnants of Thomas's old lumber supply that still sat behind the house. Lucy had not been able to look at Thomas's tools and materials without a complicated grief she did not have time to process, so she had been avoiding the pile for more than a year, and watching Phineas move through it with practical, respectful hands, selecting what was needed and leaving the rest in order, was a stranger experience than she had anticipated. On the third day, he spoke to the man at the livery stable about buying a used buckboard at a price that allowed Lucy to transport larger food orders from the general store without hiring a wagon, and this represented a monthly savings that improved her numbers visibly and immediately. On the fourth day, without being asked, and without mentioning that he was doing it, he got up at 4 in the morning and repaired the draft on the kitchen stove that had been causing it to run hot on one side and cool on the other for as long as Lucy had been using it. She came down at 5 to find the kitchen warmer and more balanced than it had ever been in her ownership of it, and she stood in the middle of the room for a moment feeling something she could not entirely categorize. Gratitude was part of it, but it was a heavier gratitude than the word usually implied, the kind that came from having something you needed done and then having it done, not because you asked and not because it purchased obligation, but simply because someone had noticed and acted. That kind of gratitude sat differently. It pressed against something inside her that she had been keeping carefully sealed. She started breakfast and did not mention the stove. He came in at 5:30 for coffee, and she handed him a cup without a word, and he drank it, and she could feel him not mentioning it either. And there was something in that shared quiet that was more communicative than most of the conversations she had with paying customers. On the fifth day, she spoke to Walter Briggs at the Caldwell Hotel. Walter was a cautious man by nature and a nervous man by circumstance. The hotel's revenues had dropped sharply since his cook's departure, and 3 of his regular long-term guests had relocated to a boarding house on the north side of town, specifically because of the food situation. He heard Lucy's proposal with the expression of a man who is trying to find the catch in an offer that sounds reasonable and is finding it difficult to locate. "You would provide the evening meal for our guests," he said, "here at your establishment." "My establishment is a 3-minute walk from the hotel," Lucy said. "Your guests come here at 6, they eat, they walk back. You post a notice at your front desk and include it in the room rate at whatever markup you see fit. You keep the markup. I charge you the standard meal price per cover. And what do I get out of this arrangement? Your guests stop leaving," Lucy said. "And new guests start choosing your hotel over the boarding house on the north end because you have dining." Walter Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who came up with this idea?" "I did," Lucy said, which was technically a simplification but was also the version she intended to sustain. She had thought about it herself before Phineas raised it. She simply had not had time to pursue it. She told herself this, and it was partially true. The arrangement was agreed upon by the end of the week. It brought her 6 additional covers per evening from the hotel guests, and within 10 days it brought 12 as word of the food spread to people who were not staying at the hotel but had heard about it from people who were. The November mortgage payment was made on time, including the arrears. The evening she came back from the bank and hung up her coat and stood in the kitchen. She took the account book out and looked at the numbers that now made sense in a way they had not made sense in 40 days, and she felt a loosening in her chest that was so unfamiliar she took a moment to identify it as relief. Phineas was at the back of the house repairing a cabinet hinge. Went and stood in the doorway. "I made the bank payment today," she said. He looked up from the hinge. "I thought you would," he said, "because of the hotel arrangement. Because you worked hard and cooked well and the arrangement gave people access to something they already wanted. That is your success. I suggested a direction." She leaned against the doorframe. "Why do you minimize your contributions?" He considered this with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I do not think I minimize them. I think I assign them their accurate size. What you have built here is yours, and I do not want you to confuse what is yours with what is borrowed." "I'm not confusing anything," she said. "I'm capable of understanding that a good idea belongs to whoever had it and that help is help, and holding both those things at once without losing track of either." He looked at her then with a directness that was different from his usual watchful attention. It was more present, more deliberate, and it lasted a half-second longer than was strictly called for by the conversation. "Yes," he said, "I can see that you are." She went back to the kitchen. She was very careful not to attach meaning to the half-second. November arrived with the cold it had promised, and the cold in Caldwell at the start of November 1882 was the serious, working kind, not decorative, not the kind of cold that makes people feel festive and picturesque, but the flat, implacable cold of the Central Plains that pressed against windows and found every imperfect seal and sat in the bones of anyone who spent too long outside it. Lucy was grateful for the repaired wall, for the wood in the yard, for the properly adjusted stove that now kept the kitchen at an even, consistent warmth that made the long hours of cooking slightly less punishing. She and Phineas had developed a rhythm by now that had the quality of something that had been in place much longer than 3 weeks. He was up before her. She was never certain when exactly he slept, because she heard him sometimes at 4 and 5 in the morning, moving quietly through the repairs and improvements that he worked through with the systematic thoroughness of a man working from a list he kept entirely in his own head. He was at the back door with coffee ready for her when she came down at 5, and this had happened so many consecutive mornings without discussion or arrangement that she had entirely stopped being surprised by it, and had begun, quietly, to be alarmed by how much she had come to rely on it. They talked in the mornings. That was when it happened, not in the evenings when customers were present and the room was full of other voices, but in the quiet, early morning kitchen over coffee, with the stove ticking warmly and the dark still heavy outside the windows. They talked about things that had no obvious practical application. He told her about places he had been, not in a way that suggested he was bragging about his range, but in the way of someone who finds geography genuinely interesting and is accustomed to keeping his observations to himself, and is finding it a relief to share them. He had been to New Orleans once briefly, and found it oppressively beautiful. He had been to a Cheyenne camp in Wyoming and been treated with a courtesy that shamed him, he said, given how his government had treated those people in return. "You acknowledge that," she said when he said it. "It would be dishonest not to," he said. "I have seen it. I know what the reservations are like. I know what the treaties have been worth." It is not comfortable to know, but discomfort does not excuse ignorance. She looked at him across the kitchen table. Not many men in a Kansas cattle town would say that. Not many, he agreed. That does not make it less true. She told him about her own history, her childhood in Ohio, her father's hardware store, the particular texture of growing up in a family where practicality was the primary religion and sentiment was acknowledged but kept in its proper place. She told him about coming to Caldwell as a bride, about Thomas, about the fever and the mortgage and the $43. "Were you happy with him?" he asked, not invasively, just honestly, the way he asked everything. He thought about it genuinely, which she had not done in some time. "I was content," she said finally. "Content is not the same as happy, but it is not suffering either. He was a good man. He was not the kind of man who made me feel like I was completely seen." She paused. "I think I understood that in a vague way at the time, but I did not have the vocabulary for it then." Phineas was quiet. "Do you have it now?" he asked. "The vocabulary." She looked at him steadily. "I am developing it." The silence that followed was the warm kind. The cold deepened in the second week of November and brought with it something Lucy had not fully accounted for in her calculations, which was that the buffalo grass around Caldwell was buried under the first real snowfall before the cattle ranchers on the eastern edge of the county had finished bringing in their herds. One rancher, a heavy-set man named Aldous Crane, who had the temperament of a man who converted all his anxiety directly into belligerence, rode into town on a Thursday morning with 3 of his ranch hands and made himself known at every establishment on Main Street with the announcement that a gang of horse thieves had been working the county since October and had made off with 11 of his horses last week. He came to Lucy's eating house because he needed to eat and because word had apparently reached even Aldous Crane about the quality of the cornbread, and he sat with his men and ate, and then spoke loudly to the room in general about the thieves and what he intended to do to them when he found them. Phineas, who was in the back repairing a shutter, came into the dining room to replace a candle sconce that had come loose from the wall. He did this with the quiet efficiency of someone who has no particular interest in the current conversation. But Lucy, who had by now developed a sensitivity to Phineas's attention that she was trying not to examine too closely, noticed that his movement slowed slightly when Crane mentioned that the tracks from the theft had led north toward the Arkansas River before cutting east toward the Indian Territory line, When Crane and his men had gone, Phineas stood at the window and looked out at the street for a moment. "You know something," Lucy said. "I know patterns," he said carefully, "from my time as a detective." What Crane described, the timing, the direction, it resembles a method I encountered twice before. A group that has been working the border towns between Kansas and the territory, selling the horses across the line. And you are thinking about what to do with that information. He turned from the window. "I am thinking," he said, "that it is not my business anymore. I am not a Pinkerton man. I'm a man who fixes shutters and splits wood. You are a man who is troubled by something he knows and is standing at a window instead of fixing the shutter," she said, "which suggests it is more your business than you are trying to make it." He looked at her for a long moment. "There is a man," he said slowly, "who I believe is working this territory. His name is Abe Deller. He ran with the Corrigan land fraud operation before it fell apart. He does not seem to have learned any particular lesson from Corrigan's imprisonment, and I have heard his name twice in the past month in conversation at the livery and the saloon. That is circumstantial, but it is uncomfortable circumstantial. Then tell the marshal. I have nothing concrete to take to the marshal. The tracks Crane described, the territory route, those are observations, not evidence." "Then get evidence," Lucy said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. "You were a Pinkerton detective for 6 years. You clearly have not lost the instincts that made you good at it, or you would not be standing at a window thinking through a horse theft pattern. Use the instincts for something useful, and then go tell the marshal." Phineas looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not a complicated expression. It was simply the expression of a man who has been pointed directly at the thing he already knew he should do, by someone who could see it clearly, and said it without varnish. "All right," he said. He went back to the shutter first, finished it properly, and then put on his coat and hat and went out. He came back after dark, after the supper service was done and the last customer had gone, and he sat down at the kitchen table and told her what he had found. He had gone to the livery, to the trading post east of town, and finally to a man he knew slightly from his Pinkerton days who was now running a small operation buying and selling livestock 20 miles north. The man had not been entirely cooperative, but he had let slip enough, a name, a rendezvous location, a repeated reference to a crossing point near a particular bend in the Arkansas River, to constitute the kind of convergent evidence that a good detective could take to a lawman. "I spoke to Marshal Holt this evening," Phineas said. "I laid out what I had. He was skeptical at first, but he is a careful man and he listened. He is going to make inquiries." "Good," Lucy said. "You were right," he said. "It was straightforward. I knew what I was looking at and I was making it complicated in my own head." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I spent 2 years being the man who pursued something right and was punished for it. It made me reluctant to insert myself into things, made me second-guess the instinct." He paused. "It is a bad habit I am working on correcting." She poured him coffee from the pot that was still hot on the stove. "The Corrigan case," she said. "The partner who buried the evidence. Did you ever find out who it was?" "Yes," he said. "Eventually. It was a man named Grant Pierce, senior agent. He was taking money from Corrigan to suppress the case. He resigned from the agency before he could be fully investigated. Last I heard he was in Texas." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I do not spend a great deal of time thinking about Grant Pierce. The damage he did to the case, to the people Corrigan defrauded, thinking about it does not repair it." "No," she said, "but forgiving it must have taken something." He looked up at her. "I have not forgiven it," he said. "I have just decided to keep living regardless." She considered this. "That is an honest answer. It is the only kind I have." The marshal made his inquiries, and the inquiries produced results faster than Phineas had expected. Within the week, there was a joint action between Holt and the county sheriff, and Abe Deller was taken at the river crossing with 4 accomplices and 17 horses that were subsequently identified as stolen from 3 different county ranchers. Aldous Crane got 11 of his horses back and rode into town to say so loudly and publicly, and in the process of being loud and public, he mentioned to 3 separate people that the information that broke the case had come from a man named Garrett who was working over at Lucy Yates' eating house. This created, for several days, a specific kind of attention that Lucy was not entirely certain how to navigate. People she had not spoken to in months came to eat and looked at Phineas with the considering looks of people reassessing something. Crane himself came back, sat at a table, ate 2 helpings of stew, and then said to Phineas without ceremony that there was a permanent position at his ranch for a man of his abilities if he wanted it, starting wages of $25 a month. Phineas thanked him politely and declined. Crane looked at Lucy, then back at Phineas. A slow look settled on his face that was not entirely without understanding. "All right," he said. He put $1 on the table for the stew. It was significantly more than the meal cost, and left without requesting change. After he left, Lucy wiped down the table and did not say anything about the look that Aldous Crane had given them. But she thought about it. She thought about it through the afternoon and through the supper service and through the washing up, and late that evening, when the house was quiet and she was sitting at the kitchen table with the account book and the fire was low in the stove, she let herself think about it with an honesty she had been managing carefully for several weeks. She was falling in love with Phineas Garrett. This was not a hypothesis or a concern. It was an observable fact that she could track the progression of with the same systematic attention she applied to her accounts. It had begun somewhere in the 2nd week, when she had found the stove repaired at 5 in the morning. It had gathered momentum through the conversations and the coffee and the window standing and the honest answers and the careful way he moved through her world, without presuming to own any part of it. It had reached, in the past week, a level where she was aware of his presence in every room of her house in a way that was entirely inconsistent with the transactional arrangement she had been insisting to herself they had. The question, the real question, the one that she turned over carefully, was whether the right thing to do with this fact was to act on it or to continue managing it. He had given her no clear indication, nothing she could point to with certainty. The half-seconds, the particular quality of his attention, these were things she might be interpreting incorrectly. She had been alone for 2 years and she was 25, and it was possible that proximity to a man who was consistently, gently competent and honest had created a fondness that she was inflating into something larger. She closed the account book. She was very good at being honest with herself. It was one of the qualities she valued most in herself, and that she felt it would be hypocritical to abandon when the subject matter became inconvenient. She was not inflating it. She thought about Thomas, about the word content and how it felt versus how something else might feel, and she thought about the specific sensation that had been living in her chest since the morning Phineas had said her name in her kitchen with coffee steam between them, and looked at her as though she were a fixed point in a geography he was navigating. She was not inflating it, and she was going to have to do something about it, or not do something about it, and either choice was going to cost her something. She went to bed. She lay in the dark listening to the wind and the faint, distant sound of the stove in Phineas's room at the back of the house, a small, intermittent ticking that meant the fire was still going, that he was there, that the winter was being held at bay by the accumulated practical facts of their shared arrangement. She slept eventually, and she did not dream about anything she could remember in the morning. December arrived with a quality of cold that was no longer merely serious but became ambitious, aspiring to something legendary. The snow that came in the first week was the kind that came to stay, not the provisional early-season snow that tested the ground and retreated, but the committed, load-bearing kind that settled on rooftops and turned the streets of Caldwell into something that required daily navigation and constant practical attention. Phineas cleared the path from the front door to the street every morning before Lucy came down, and the front path was always clear when the first customers arrived, and she had begun to understand that this was the nature of how he operated. not announcing his contributions, not performing them for acknowledgement, simply doing the necessary things because they were necessary, and it was his nature to address the necessary. She had begun to look at his hands when he did not know she was looking. This was new, this specific habit, and she recognized it for what it was. The hotel arrangement was providing steady income, and December brought its own business in the form of traveling men who were more inclined to sit with hot food and warm coffee in a pleasant room than to brave the cold unnecessarily. Lucy hired a girl from the edge of town, a 15-year-old named Bess Hooper, whose family needed the income and who turned out to be hardworking and quick-learning, and who had the additional quality of being entirely blind to subtleties in human dynamics, which Lucy found refreshing in the specific way that people who are navigating complicated feelings find straightforward company restful. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of December, when the supper service had wound down and Bess had gone home, and the room was quiet, and the snow outside was visible in the lamplight, something thin and strange and significant happened. Lucy had come out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee for herself, the first time all day she had sat with it, genuinely, just to sit, and Phineas was at the far end of the dining room making some adjustment to the window frame that was letting in a thread of cold air. She sat at the table nearest the stove, and after a few minutes he finished what he was doing and she said, "Come and sit," and he did. They sat with their coffee in the warm, quiet room, and outside the snow was coming down again in the lamplight, and something about the combination of the warmth and the quiet and the window-framed snow, and the fact that she was very tired and her defenses were accordingly reduced produced in Lucy a state of openness that she might, in another mood, have been more careful with. "What do you want?" she said. "After the winter, when spring comes." He held his coffee cup. "I have not planned that far. You should plan. You told me that men who don't plan leave themselves at the mercy of circumstance. I think you told me that," he said. "Or I told it to someone and you were listening. Either way it is true." She looked at him. "What do you want? Not the practical what, not the next job or the next town. What do you actually want when you let yourself want something?" Phineas was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. Then he said, "I want to stop moving. I have been moving for so long that I have sometimes wondered whether I have lost the capacity to stay somewhere. But the capacity to stay, that is not something you lose. You just need a reason to stay." "A reason," she said. "Or a person," he said and looked at her. And this time the half-second was not half a second but a full, deliberate, unhurried look that said exactly what it said and did not attempt to say anything else. Lucy set her coffee cup down. Her heart was doing something she elected not to describe. "I would be," she said carefully, "a great deal of work. I am not an easy woman. I am not uncertain or yielding or particularly prone to deferring to anyone else's judgment on matters that concern me. I am also not good at pretending I do not want what I want, once I know what it is." "I know," he said. The words were so simple and so direct, and so entirely without reservation that she felt them as a physical thing, a warm pressure against the sealed place in her chest. "I have been watching you run this house and manage your accounts and feed 20 people a night and make hard decisions and never flinch for 6 weeks. I know exactly who you are." He paused. "I think you are the most capable person I have ever known, and I think you are lonely in a way that your capability does not resolve. And I think you know both those things about yourself." She did know both those things. "What are you saying exactly?" she said. "I am saying," Phineas Garrett said, with the deliberate, careful honesty that was the fundamental quality of everything he did, "that I came in from the cold and sat down at your table uninvited and made a declaration about the winter because I was hungry and tired and had no other plan. That part was true, but I stayed because of you. I did not intend to stay for the reason I am staying, but I am not going to pretend it is something other than what it is." "And what is it?" she said. "It is that I want to be the person who makes your path clear in the morning," he said. "And the person you talk to when the accounts are difficult and the person you sit with when you finally have a quiet moment. And I want those things in a permanent way, not an arrangement for the winter way, a permanent way. The fire in the stove ticked quietly. Outside, the snow continued its patient, indifferent accumulation. Lucy Yates looked at Phineas Garrett across the table in the warm light of her eating house, and she thought about all the ways this was not sensible, and all the ways that being sensible had never fully insulated her from anything that mattered. And then she stopped thinking about it in that way, and simply looked at him, and let herself know what she knew. "I think," she said, "that you should stay past the winter." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were not stormy at all in this moment, she realized, but still, entirely still, the way water goes still when it finds the level it was looking for. "Yes," he said. He did not reach across the table. He did not move precipitously. He waited, as he had waited for everything, with the patience of a man who does not take what he has not been given. And she put her hand on the table between them, flat, palm down, simply placing it there as a statement. His hand came over hers, warm and slightly rough, and they sat that way in the quiet room with the snow outside, and the coffee going cold, and neither of them feeling the need to say anything more than what had already been said. Christmas of 1882 came to Caldwell with the particular character of a frontier Christmas, spare in some ways and extravagant in others, as though the harshness of the land required the holiday to work harder to announce itself. The church on the corner of Main Street was strung with cedar boughs, and the general store had received a shipment of hard candies and ribbon that caused a significant amount of excitement in the younger portion of the population. And Lucy cooked for 3 days straight in preparation for the Christmas supper that had become, by now, the talk of the town. She made roasted beef and potato soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, and rolls that came out of the oven golden and fragrant, and an apple pie with a lattice top that Bess Hooper said made her feel like crying from happiness, which Lucy took as a professional success. She made Christmas supper for 32 people, which was more than she had ever cooked for at one time, and all 32 people ate more than was strictly reasonable, and went home into the cold night looking slightly dazed from the good of it, which was exactly the effect she had intended. When the last plate was washed and Bess had gone home and the candles were burning low, and the room held the particular satisfied quiet of a space that has been used for exactly the purpose it was built for, Phineas came out of the back with 2 small glasses and a bottle of whiskey that he had been holding in reserve. "From the Crane Ranch," he said. "Aldous left it as a Christmas gift. He seems to have decided he likes us." "He likes you," Lucy said. "He tolerates me because I feed him." "He respects you," Phineas said. "He is simply constitutionally unable to express it in a way that is easy to receive." She laughed. She had been laughing more, these past weeks, in a way that surprised her each time it happened. Not because she was an unhappy woman, she had not been an unhappy woman, but because there was a difference between the occasional laugh and the regular laughter of a person who is in a state of sustained contentment, and she was only now becoming reacquainted with the latter. He poured 2 small glasses, and they sat at the corner table by the stove, and she thought that this was the best Christmas she had spent since Ohio, and then she thought that might not be a fully accurate characterization, because there was something in this one that Ohio did not have, and what Ohio did not have was sitting across from her with a glass of whiskey and a look of quiet satisfaction that she had put there. In January, 2 things happened that changed the shape of the future. The first was that Walter Briggs at the hotel, emboldened by the success of the dining arrangement and convinced enough of Lucy's abilities to invest, came to her with a proposal. Would she consider taking on the hotel's breakfast service as well, in exchange for a 50% share of the hotel dining revenue? This was a significant increase in both work and income, and Lucy took 48 hours to think it through before coming back to Walter with a counter-proposal that gave her 40% of the breakfast revenue, but gave her control over the menu, the sourcing, and the staffing. Walter, who had come to understand that Lucy Yates negotiated in straight lines with no decorative curves, agreed. The second thing that happened was that Phineas went to the cattlemen's bank and made inquiries about the parcel of land adjacent to Lucy's property, a small lot to the east, currently unused, that had been owned by a man who had left the territory 2 years ago and whose ownership had passed, through a debt settlement, to the bank itself. He came back with information and numbers and sat across from her at the kitchen table with the account book open between them and showed her what he was thinking. "If we build a proper kitchen extension onto the east side of the house," he said, "using that lot, you double your cooking space without losing any of the dining room. The breakfast expansion is going to create a timing problem in the current kitchen. 2 services running out of the same space will create bottlenecks that slow you down and stress the food quality." He pointed to the numbers. "The lot is not expensive. The bank wants it off their books. The construction costs are high up front, but the return on the investment, given the hotel income, is approximately 6 months. After that, it is purely additive." He looked up from the numbers and found her looking at him rather than at the account book. "What?" he said. "You said we," she said. He paused, looked at what he had said. A slight change in his expression, something warm, something careful, something that made a decision about itself. "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at the account book. She looked at the numbers. They were very good numbers, even given the upfront cost. "There is a practical problem," she said. "A woman running an eating house with a hired man is one thing. A woman running an establishment and purchasing property jointly with a man to whom she is not married is quite another thing, in a town like this, in this year." "Yes," he said, "people will talk. They will. It will affect the business. It might," he said carefully, "or it might not, depending on how it is handled." "How would you handle it?" she said. He was quiet. Then he said, simply and without theater, "I would like to handle it by asking you to marry me, which is a thing I was going to ask regardless of the property question, but the property question has brought the timing forward somewhat." Lucy Yates was not a woman who was frequently rendered speechless. This was not one of the times she was. She said, "That is the least romantic marriage proposal I have ever heard." "That is fair," he said. "Let me try again." He pushed the account book to the side. He said, "Lucy, I have been moving for 2 years, and before that I was working a job that made me think in terms of cases and evidence and conclusions, and neither of those things is a particularly good preparation for saying the simple true thing. The simple true thing is that I walked into this room hungry and stubborn and not entirely sure of the next 5 minutes, let alone the next 5 years. And you fed me and looked at me like I was worth taking seriously, and gave me a purpose and a place, and I have been. I have been happier in this house, in these 2 months, than I have been since before I knew what unhappy was." He paused. "I would like to stay the winter and the spring and the summer and every winter and spring and summer after that. I would like to be your husband. I would like to be the person who makes your path clear in the morning for the rest of my life." She had told him once that she was not good at pretending she did not want what she wanted. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He reached across the account book and took her hand. They were married in February of 1883, on a Saturday, in the church with the cedar boughs which had been replaced by dried flowers that the minister's wife arranged with a precision that suggested it had been planned significantly in advance of the wedding itself. The ceremony was brief because both of them preferred brevity to ceremony, but the feeling in the room was not brief. It was large and warm and real, the feeling of a group of people who had been watching something unfold and were pleased to see it land where it should. Bess Hooper cried, which she would later deny. Marshall Holt was there and shook Phineas's hand with the firmness of a man who has decided to approve of something. Walter Briggs attended and brought his wife, who had been skeptical of Lucy's cooking enterprise until she ate the Christmas pie, and had been unambiguously supportive of everything Lucy did thereafter. Aldous Crane was not there, because Aldous Crane did not attend social events as a rule, but he sent over a side of beef 2 days before the wedding with a note that said only "congratulations," and a second note that said "for the cooking," which, as Phineas pointed out, was high praise and the only currency Aldous Crane traded. The winter after the wedding was different from the winter before it. It had the same cold and the same snow and the same dark mornings, but it held them differently. The way a hand holds a stone is different from the way the ground holds it, and the stone is the same stone, but the holding changes everything about how it is experienced. They began construction on the kitchen extension in March, when the ground softened enough to permit it. Phineas did a significant portion of the work himself, with 2 hired men from the edge of town, and the lumber from a mill 40 miles north that Phineas negotiated down from the first price, with the easy confidence of a man who knows what things are worth, and is not embarrassed to say so. Lucy fed all 3 of them lunch every day during construction, which became a small, daily, practical demonstration of the principle that had started the whole thing, that feeding people was the beginning of almost everything, that the table was the place where the world organized itself into something manageable. The extension was finished in May. It doubled her cooking space exactly as Phineas had projected, and the timing bottleneck that had been strangling the breakfast service immediately resolved, and by June, the hotel arrangement was running at a profit that exceeded both of their projections, and required the hiring of 2 additional women to help with the morning service. Lucy hired them, trained them, and paid them fairly, which created a small but notable reputation for the eating house that went beyond the food, a reputation as a place where women who needed work were treated as the capable people they were. In the summer of 1883, the nature of their life together settled into the shape it would hold for many years. Busy and purposeful and full of the daily, accumulative joy of 2 people who know themselves, and know each other, and have found in each other's company something that neither abundance nor scarcity can fundamentally alter. They argued sometimes over business decisions, over approaches, over the specific and recurring question of how much Phineas should do personally versus how much should be hired out, Lucy being of the opinion that he pushed himself past reasonable limits, and Phineas being of the opinion that work was not a burden if the reason for it was right. These arguments were honest and direct and resolved quickly, because both of them had, it turned out, the same fundamental disposition toward resolution, the belief that the argument existed to find the truth, not to win territory, and that finding the truth together was more interesting than winning alone. They were good at being married. This was not a given. It was an achievement, like any achievement, built from daily decisions and the accumulated practice of choosing toward each other instead of away. In the autumn of 1883, Lucy discovered she was expecting a child. She told Phineas on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year from the morning he had walked into her eating house and sat down without being asked. She told him in the kitchen, over coffee, in the way she told him everything directly and without decoration. He sat very still for a moment after she told him. Then he got up and held her, which was not something that required words, and she stood in his arms in the warm kitchen with the stove ticking and the autumn light coming in the window, and thought about the chain of small, contingent events that had produced this moment. The cold October wind, the open door, the uninvited stranger, the bowl of beef stew, the 20-cent piece left on the table. All the things that could so easily have been otherwise and were not, and had produced this specific, unrepeatable warmth. Their son was born in May of 1884, a large and healthy boy who announced himself with considerable volume, and then settled into the world with the considering look of someone who is taking in information before deciding how he feels about it. They named him Thomas, after Lucy's first husband, because Phineas suggested it and Lucy understood that he had suggested it because he was that kind of man, the kind who makes room for the whole history of a person's life instead of only the part that included him. Thomas Garrett grew up in the kitchen of his mother's eating house and the wood yard of his father's practical industry, and he had his mother's directness and his father's patience and the gray-eyed watchfulness that was so unmistakably Phineas that strangers who met the boy sometimes asked if the father was nearby. The bank foreclosure that had been looming in October of 1882 became, by the spring of 1885, a very distant memory. The mortgage paid off in full with a ceremony at the bank that Walter Briggs attended uninvited but was not turned away from, because by then Lucy was not the kind of woman who turned away the people who had helped her, regardless of whether they had been invited. The eating house was, by 1885, the most reliably excellent place to eat between Wichita and the Texas border, and this was known not only among the traveling men and the cattle operators, but among the women of the county who had heard about the way Lucy Yates hired and trained and paid, and who had begun sending their daughters and sisters and nieces to ask about work with a frequency that made the kitchen more full than it had ever been. Phineas had, by this time, settled into the life of a man who had found his purpose in the specific combination of his own skills and the needs of the place he had chosen to stay. He managed the supply relationships for the eating house, negotiated the hotel contract renewals with Walter Briggs each year, maintained the building and its expanding footprint with the same systematic attention he had applied to the cracked porch step 3 years before. He was on the town council by 1885, which had happened because Marshall Holt had suggested it, and because enough of the town's business owners had said yes loudly enough that it became difficult to decline. He served on the council with the same quality he brought to everything, the quality of a man who says true things and who has no personal agenda that requires the sacrifice of accuracy to maintain. He was also, and this was the part that Lucy thought about sometimes with a feeling she had no exact word for, an extraordinarily good father. He was patient in the way that was not permissiveness. He held standards and maintained them, but he held them with the steady, calm energy of a man who understood that children were small people navigating a large world and deserved honest guidance rather than performance. Thomas at age 2 could not yet appreciate this, but Lucy could, and she observed it with the same careful attention she had always brought to the things that mattered. In the fall of 1885, the one remaining thread of Phineas's past, the thing that had sat quietly at the back of their life like a sound at the edge of hearing, resolved itself in a way neither of them had anticipated. A man named Harold Pierce came to Caldwell in September, a lawyer from St. Louis with a careful face, and a letter of introduction from a law firm that handled estate matters. He was looking for a Phineas Garrett, formerly of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, in connection with the estate of a Grant Pierce, deceased. Grant Pierce had died in August in San Antonio. The man who had buried Phineas's evidence on the Corrigan case, the man who had taken Corrigan's money and destroyed the case that Phineas had built. He had died not violently, but of the mundane and impartial agency of a heart that had simply stopped working, and he had left an estate that was, upon examination, partly constituted from money he had received from sources whose nature Harold Pierce delicately declined to specify, but which both Phineas and Lucy understood clearly enough. Grant Pierce had, in some last gesture that Harold Pierce said he could not fully explain, but which he suspected related to the question of dying with one's conscience in better order than one had lived with it, stipulated in his will that a portion of his estate's $740 be forwarded to Phineas Garrett, in recognition of a debt of professional integrity that cannot be fully repaid. Phineas stood in the dining room of the eating house where he had first sat down uninvited and looked at the check that Harold Pierce set on the table and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is there a provision in the will for the people that Corrigan defrauded?" The original victims of the land scheme. Harold Pierce said that the will did not address that specifically. "Then I would like," Phineas said, "to use this money toward whatever process might allow it to reach them. I do not know whether that is legally straightforward or whether it is even possible, but I would like that to be investigated." Harold Pierce looked at him with the expression of a man who had expected a different response and was revising his assessment of the situation. "That is," he said carefully, "an unusual instruction." "Yes," Phineas said, "but it is the right one." Harold Pierce took the instruction back to St. Louis and began making inquiries, and the result of those inquiries, 3 months later, was a partial restitution to 11 of the original Corrigan fraud victims. Not the full amounts they had lost, but meaningful portions of them, and accompanied by a letter from the St. Louis law firm that explained the source in terms that were as precise as Harold Pierce could make them. Phineas did not talk about this publicly. He told Lucy in full, in the kitchen, over coffee, in the way he told her everything, and she listened and said what she thought, which was that it was the right decision made for the right reason, and that she was not surprised he had made it, and that was one of the things she loved about him. The winter of 1885 arrived with the now familiar cold, and the familiar business of preparation, wood stacked against the side of the house, in a quantity that was now not a concern, but simply an annual fact. The kitchen extension warm and functional, and full of the smells of bread and stew and coffee that had become the smell of their life together. Lucy discovered she was pregnant again in December of 1885, and this time she told Phineas in the dining room. In the evening, after the last customer had gone, at the same table where he had sat on that first October night with his hat in his hands and his hunger laid plain before her. She told him because the table felt right for it, because this was the table where the whole thing had started, where he had said the words that had changed the shape of her world, and it seemed correct to close the loop at the same point where it had opened. He looked at the table between them and then at her, and his face was everything she had learned to love about it, honest and still and certain in the way of a man who has made his peace with uncertainty and found it finally navigable. "Another Thomas," he said. "I do not know yet," she said. "It is too early to know." "If it is a girl," he said, "may I suggest a name?" "What name?" he said. "Ruth. It was my mother's name." Lucy considered this with the care she brought to all important considerations, which meant that she looked at it from several angles and then decided it was right. "Ruth Garrett," she said. "Yes," he said. Ruth Garrett was born in August of 1886, on a morning when the summer light came hard and clear through the kitchen window, and the whole town of Caldwell was going about its ordinary business outside, and she arrived with the same energetic announcement her brother had made. But she had her mother's brown eyes and her father's steady gaze and a quality about her, even at 1 hour old, of knowing exactly where she was and deciding she approved. Thomas was 2 1/4, and inspected his sister with the scientific rigor of someone determining whether a new piece of furniture was an improvement on the existing arrangement. He reached out and touched her hand with one deliberate finger. She closed her fingers around his, the automatic, uncalculating grip of a newborn, and Thomas looked at this fact with the gray-eyed, considering look he had inherited from his father. "She is keeping my finger," he told Phineas. "Yes," said Phineas. "Is she allowed to do that?" "I think," said Phineas, "that we should let her." Lucy, who had been watching this exchange from the bed with the specific, superlative exhaustion of a woman who has just done the hardest physical thing a human body can do and is nevertheless entirely present in the moment, thought that this was the truest sentence she had ever heard her husband say. They let her. The years that followed had the quality of things that have found their true shape, not static, not without their difficulties and their griefs and their ordinary abrasions, but fundamentally sound in the way that structures built on good foundations are sound. The eating house grew. The hotel arrangement became a permanent feature of both establishments, so woven into the fabric of each that it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. The kitchen extension got a second extension in 1888, because the breakfast service had expanded beyond what the first extension could comfortably handle, and Phineas built most of it himself over 2 months with the same focused, patient industry that had produced the original arrangements. Thomas grew up and developed, to no one's great surprise, a talent for negotiation. He had inherited his father's ability to see patterns in situations and his mother's directness in addressing them, and by the time he was 6, he was known throughout the town as the child who could settle any dispute on the street between other children, with a fairness that made all parties feel they had been treated well even when they had not entirely prevailed. Ruth grew up and developed a talent for cooking that exceeded even Lucy's own considerable abilities, a fact that Lucy acknowledged without jealousy because she was the kind of person who found excellence in others more interesting than threatening. Ruth would be in the kitchen beside her mother from the age of 3, and by 5 she had opinions about spice balances that were not incorrect, and by 7 she was making the cornbread that had been Lucy's signature since the beginning, and making it with a slight variation of her own that everyone agreed was better than the original. Caldwell changed around them, as frontier towns changed in the 1880s. The cattle drives diminished and then effectively ended as the railheads pushed further west and the ranges were fenced, and the old wildness of the border town was replaced by the quieter, more complicated wildness of a community trying to decide what it wanted to be. Some of the establishments that had defined the town's rough years closed or changed their character. The saloons became fewer. The churches became more. The school was expanded twice. Through all of it, the eating house remained. It remained because Lucy had built it on something real, on the simple and sufficient fact that people needed to eat, and that eating well was not a luxury but a form of dignity, and that a table where everyone was welcome and the food was honest was a thing worth maintaining through all the changes a territory could throw at it. In the spring of 1890, Phineas was offered the position of county sheriff following Marshal Holt's retirement. He came home with the offer and sat across from Lucy at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, the one they had sat at for 8 years, and laid it out the way he laid out all practical matters, plainly and with all the relevant information present. "It is a good position," he said. "I believe I could do it well. But it changes the nature of what we are doing here, and that is a decision that belongs to both of us." "What does it change?" she said. "It is more dangerous than what I do now, not enormously but honestly. It also takes me away from here during the hours you need help most." He paused. "But it is work I believe in, and I think the county would be better served by someone who brings honesty to the position rather than someone who brings ambition." She thought about it. She looked at him across the table at the face she knew entirely by now, every line and weathermark of it, the gray eyes that were still and certain, the hands that had fixed her wall and split her wood and held her children and made her path clear in the morning for 8 years. "You want to do it," she said. "I think it is what I am for," he said. "I think being a detective and then losing that work the way I lost it, it was preparing me for something that required honesty more than it required an agency's approval, and this is that something." "Then do it," she said. "The breakfast service runs itself now. Bess Hooper has been running the morning shift for 2 years without needing me to supervise. We will reorganize." "You are certain?" "I am always certain," she said. "You know that." He smiled, a full, genuine smile that was not as rare as it had been in October of 1882, but was still not something he produced casually, and it had retained for this reason the quality of something that meant exactly what it looked like. "Yes," he said, "I do know that." Phineas Garrett was sworn in as Sumner County Sheriff in June of 1890, in a ceremony at the courthouse that the whole town attended, because the whole town had decided, in the collective, organic way that communities make decisions, that this was an occasion worth attending. He wore a clean coat and the badge was pinned straight, and he looked exactly like himself, which was to say like a man who had found the right latitude after a long time traveling and had finally, permanently, stopped moving. Lucy stood at the edge of the crowd and watched him take the oath with the same feeling she had been carrying for 8 years now. The feeling that did not have a single clean word for it, but that was constituted of pride and certainty, and a deep, structural gratitude for the October wind that had blown open her door and delivered to her table a stubborn, honest, gray-eyed drifter who had made one outrageous declaration, and then spent the rest of his life being exactly as good as that declaration promised. After the ceremony, in the crowd outside the courthouse, Thomas took Phineas's hand and Ruth held Lucy's, and they walked back toward the eating house together through the summer morning of a frontier town in the process of becoming something more than it had been. And Lucy thought, this is the thing. This is what it is. Not the dramatic first moment, not the theatrical pronouncement over the uninvited supper, though she would never entirely stop being fond of that story, because it was their story and it was genuinely theirs, but this. The morning, the children. The table that would have food on it tonight, as it had every night for 8 years, and the man walking beside her who had asked to stay the winter and had, in every way that mattered, kept that promise in perpetuity. She thought of the 20-cent piece he had left on the table that first night. She still had it. It sat on the small shelf in the kitchen beside her account book, which was the first one she had ever kept, and which she had long since finished using but could not bring herself to throw away. She had put the coin there the morning after that first night, and it had stayed there through all the years and all the changes and all the additions to the household. And she had never explained it to anyone, and no one had ever asked. And it remained there as a small, specific monument to the particular hinge point in a life where everything before it was one thing and everything after it was another. She squeezed Ruth's hand, and Ruth squeezed back with the unconscious, absolute trust of a 4-year-old who has never been given a reason to doubt the hands that hold her. Phineas caught her eye over the children's heads. He had the look of a man who knows something, which he often had, but today it was the specific look of a man who knows what he has and is looking directly at it. She met his gaze and did not look away, because she never had. The walking crowd moved around them, and the morning was clear, and the summer sky over Kansas was the particular vast blue that made it look as though the world went on forever in every direction, which in most ways it did. And the eating house was a 3-minute walk ahead of them, with the kitchen warm and the bread already in the oven, and the day's work already begun in the organized, purposeful, living way of a thing built by good hands and kept by honest ones. They went home. They had always been going home. That was the whole truth of it, and there was nothing left to add.